Good evening all and welcome to week 3 of the June content extravaganza. This week we have home week, lots of stuff that happened at home. It's gonna be creepy. Before we begin though, I'd like to remind everyone about my Patreon. The link can be found in the description. For signing up you get some cool perks and you get to support me personally, which means a hell of a lot to me. So if you'd like some cool exclusive stuff, I'd love it if you could check out the link. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My mother hadn't seen her best friend in years, so when her friend offered to fly her out as a surprise birthday gift, Mum was ecstatic. After getting the all clear from her doctor, she packed her bags and left for a 2-week trip. It was a rare break, one she deserved, and I encouraged her to go. That meant I had the house to myself. I wasn't the type to throw parties or have people over. I worked, came home and relaxed. I'd lived alone before on campus, in apartments, even as a teenager when Mum was away. I wasn't some delicate little thing either. I'm average build, but strong enough to hold my own if I have to. Or so I thought. The first few days passed without incident. I worked, brought groceries, watched movies, the usual. But by the start of the second week, I felt off, not exactly scared, just unsettled, like something was slightly out of place. That night I visited a friend's house. We gorged on junk food, watched horror movies and laughed like teenagers do. One of the films we picked was Psycho, the infamous shower scene, Norman Bates, the final shot of him grinning like a demon. It stuck with me more than I expected. I got home around midnight. My house is rural and isolated. The nearest neighbor is a mile away, and we had one of those big, automatic pole lights outside, like a street lamp, but ever since Mum left it had started to flicker. Sometimes it barely worked at all. That night it was giving off only the faintest, intermittent glow. I parked, used my phone's flashlight to find the path, and turned it off since I reached the porch. No porch light, just darkness. As I reached for my key, I heard our porch cat meowing from the swing. She's not really our cat, just a stray we feed. Mum and I are both allergic, so she wasn't allowed inside. She usually greeted us with a few happy meows, but this time she hissed, sharp and angry, aimed at something I couldn't see. But I ignored her and stepped inside. And that's when I felt it. A twinge in the back of my neck. A chill that skittered down my spine, like I had just walked into a trap. I paused, trying to brush it off. Then, faint but clear, I heard it. Crunch, like someone biting into cereal. I was stunned. My house was quiet, and my brain offered explanations. Floorboard, settling. Animal, perhaps. I forced myself to go to bed. But that next night it happened again. I got home late from work, nearly midnight. I had to close the gas station and was exhausted. This time the pole light outside was completely dead, just my headlights cutting through the darkness. I sprinted to the porch, and again the hiss of the cat. And 3 crunches. Like someone outside was slowly and deliberately chewing something. Well, that night at around 2 a.m., a loud noise yanked me out of sleep. Something had hit the porch hard enough and loud enough to shake the quiet house. My bedroom's in the exact center, yet I heard it like it was right outside the door. Still half asleep, I padded out the hallway, phone in hand, heart thudding. Our front door has a large window, and from the hallway I could see through it clearly. And I wish I hadn't looked. The pole light outside was back on, and standing directly under it, on our porch, was a man. He was tall, thin, dressed in neat, oddly formal clothes, and in one arm he held my cat, and in the other, a spoon. I froze halfway, hidden behind the wall, barely daring to breathe. The man wasn't doing anything, just standing there, cradling my squirming, clearly uncomfortable cat. Then, as casually as someone having a midnight snack, He dipped his spoon into the automatic cat feeder on the porch. He opened the compartment and was eating the dry kibble like it was cereal. One slow bite after another. My cat hissed and tried to wiggle free. He didn't react. He just smiled. And it wasn't an ordinary smile either. It was the psycho smile. The Norman Bates I wouldn't hurt a fly smile. He sat down on the porch swing, let the cat go, and continued eating, watching the night like it was a movie. That's when I sneezed, and his head snapped to the window, his eyes locked on mine. I thought I was hidden, but I wasn't. He saw me and knew I was there, and he knew I was alone. And he kept smiling. I brought up my phone, fingers shaking, to dial 911. He shook his head slowly, and then spoke 2 words calm as ever. "Do not." That broke me. I started crying, panicking and struggling to breathe. He stood up, grinning, waved at me like an old friend, and walked off the porch. Just as he stepped into the dark, the light flickered out. I collapsed in the hallway sobbing, called the police, my mother, and every friend and cousin I had. I thought maybe it would be my last night alive. The police arrived, searched everywhere and found nothing. No footprints, no man, no sign anyone had ever been there, aside from the missing cat food. They didn't believe me either, which was the worst thing. I stopped staying there alone. My friends came over, my cousins, my friend from the night before came over that same night, and I called off work for the rest of the week. Mum came home to find me hollow-eyed, barely sleeping, and she took care of me for once. We brought the cat inside. No more porch snacks, not for her, and definitely not for him. I loved horror movies growing up. My dad used to rent them for me all the time, despite my mum's protests. But I craved that kind of fear. The one that tingles in your stomach when the music builds up and the character in the movie doesn't realize something's creeping up behind them. That's the kind that makes you jump, but might leave you laughing a moment later. That kind of fear is fun. But what I felt on that autumn night, when I was 8 years old, was something else entirely. I grew up just north of Toronto, in a beautiful 2-story house that, even now, 17 years later, still feels like home. It wasn't a small town, and not one of those places where everyone knows everyone, somewhere in the middle, but it was safe. Sure, there were occasional stranger danger rumors. Kids sometimes said they saw someone lurking in the forest and ravines that bordered parts of town, but they were just stories. And besides, my sister and I had been taught well. Always lock the doors, never talk to strangers, never get in anyone's car, the basics. This happened in early fall. The maple trees had just started turning, casting the streets into a fiery red and orange, and the days shortened as darkness came ever steadier and ever earlier. It was around 8 p.m, pitch black outside. My parents and my older sister were out for the evening, just leaving my middle sister Kay and myself at home. Kay wanted to invite a friend over and suggested we walk to meet her halfway. It was about a 5-minute walk, but to us, it felt like a big adventure. Before we could leave, Kay realized she couldn't find her house key. We searched everywhere with no luck. While she kept looking, I remembered that my parents kept a spare key hidden in the garage for emergencies. But the garage wasn't connected to the house, no interior door, so you had to open the big garage door from the outside or use the side door. I didn't have the key, so I opened the main garage door. I remember it clearly, the cool air, the shadows creeping across the floor. I found the key, and as I turned back towards the keypad to close the garage door, I saw headlights. I paused, expecting to see a familiar car, maybe my parents or my sister returning early. But it wasn't anyone I knew. A beige Montana minivan was slowly rolling up the driveway. It stopped just 10 feet from where we were, and I stood there while the engine ran. Then the window rolled down and the driver door slightly opened, A man leaned out, his head and shoulders hanging out the window, one hand on the door. He was positioned like he could jump out in a second if he wanted to. He was big, shaved completely bald, his scalp shiny under the garage light. He had a thick soul patch on his chin, and I stared frozen as he looked at me. Then he spoke. There was a strange lightness in his voice. I think as a child, it might have sounded friendly, but as an adult, I now hear something else in it, something almost gleeful and eager. Are you home alone? That's the moment I learned what real fear was. The kind that stiffens every muscle in your body, makes your stomach twist into knots. The kind you see in horror movies, where the victim doesn't run because they can't. Their body refuses to. That was me. I was 8, tiny and defenseless. The driveway was empty. The garage was empty. And there were no adult voices, no signs of safety, and no hope. I felt like I had floated outside of myself, watching this happen to another little girl. This wasn't happening to me. I couldn't be taken. That kind of stuff doesn't actually happen, not here and not to me. And then, he was gone. I heard tires screech. I blinked. The man had thrown himself back into his van and peeled out the driveway, tires squealing as he reversed and sped off into the night. It took me a second to understand what had just happened. Then I heard the sound that must have saved me. The front door opened. Kay had come out. I can only assume he didn't want to risk whoever it was opening that door, whether it was a parent, neighbor, or someone else who may see his face or give chase. Later, when my parents got home, we called the police and filed a report. They came, took statements, drove around, but nothing came of it and he was never found. Over time, the other kids in the neighborhood started sharing their own little stories, unsettling moments. To this day, I have no idea what would have happened had my sister not opened the door right then. And I try not to imagine what a grown man in a minivan had planned for a tiny 8-year-old girl, standing alone in an open garage. My dad bought this old house with plans to tear it down and build a modern place in its footprint. It was originally built in 1916, and there was something off about it from the start. The layout didn't make sense. 3 separate bedrooms, each with its own exterior door, bathroom, and a thin interior door leading to a shared central kitchen and living room. It felt more like a collection of motel rooms than a house. Maybe it had been some kind of boarding house? I always got a strange feeling inside. The whole place was wood. Not just the floor, but the walls and ceiling too. All dark-stained slats that made it feel like the house had been preserved in molasses. Let me start off by giving you some background. I'm a 19-year-old living in Melbourne, Australia. I'm not exactly built like a tank, just about 5'8", not very muscular either. And growing up, that made me feel, well, vulnerable, especially around the bigger lads. That's part of why I spent most of my teenage years at home. It's where I felt safest. But all it took was one night to destroy that illusion forever. I was 17 when it happened. My parents had gone away for the weekend to celebrate their 20th wedding anniversary. I've got 3 siblings, 2 older brothers who live on their own, and a younger sister who happened to be sleeping over at a friend's place that weekend. So it was just me at home, and to be honest, I liked it. Peace and quiet. What I didn't know was that by the end of the weekend, my definition of safe would never be the same again. It was around 11 p.m. on the Saturday night, and I was upstairs watching TV. That's when I heard a faint sound like a knock coming from downstairs. I paused the TV and listened. Now, I'm a naturally paranoid person, so my brain immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. But this time I told myself it was nothing, probably just the wind or the house settling. So I went back to my show. A few episodes later, I got thirsty and decided to head downstairs for a drink. Just to give you an idea of the layout, the staircase faces the front door. Just to the left is a short hallway that leads to a bigger open-plan area where the kitchen and family room are, and the hallway's so narrow you can see right through it from the front door. As soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something was wrong. The front door was unlocked. I knew it was unlocked because the deadbolt sat horizontally. And that was a problem, because I knew I had locked it when my parents left. I even double-checked it like I always do. That is how paranoid I am. Still, I told myself I must have imagined it. I locked it again, grabbed a drink, and turned off the lights and went to bed. About 20 minutes later, I was jolted awake by the sound of a door closing downstairs. It wasn't the front door. I was sure I'd locked it, and no one else had a key but my parents. Every instinct I had was screaming, "Do not go down there." But I was groggy, not thinking straight, and for some stupid reason I decided to check it out. I crept down the stairs, trying not to make a sound. I knew which step creaked in the middle, so I stuck to the edges, carefully easing my weight down each one. My heart was hammering in my chest. Once I reached the ground floor, my eyes had adjusted to the dark. I could make out the shapes of furniture scattered around the living room, and that probably saved my life. If I had bumped into something, I would have made a noise. I slowly peeked around the corner of the stairs, and there, standing in the kitchen, was a man. He was a giant, at least 6'5", and I froze. I could feel the blood draining from my face. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe, I was paralyzed. I kept telling myself, "He hasn't seen you. Don't move." I don't know how long I stood there before I managed to inch backwards, one step at a time. Every moment felt like life or death. Every floorboard was a loaded gun. My only goal was to now make it back upstairs without alerting him. But just as I reached the bottom step, a loud creak echoed through the house. My blood turned to ice. He heard me. I didn't stop to think, I just ran. I sprinted up the stairs, slammed my bathroom door shut, and backed into the furthest corner. That's when I remembered. None of the interior doors in our house had locks, not even the bathroom. I looked around for a weapon, anything, and the only thing in reach was a pen on my desk. I grabbed it and gripped it so tight my hand went numb. My heart was pounding so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Then I heard the boots, heavy and deliberate, coming up the wooden stairs. Then silence just outside my door. And then the voice. "I know you're in there, and I'm gonna end you." The door exploded open, and before I even had time to think, I lunged and drove the pen straight into his shoulder. Pure instinct, he let out a scream, loud and guttural, and dropped to the floor. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. I flew down the stairs, flung it open, and sprinted barefoot to my neighbor's house, pounding on the door until they opened it. I was breathless, shaking and barely able to speak. I told them everything and they called the police while I waited inside with them. When the officers finally arrived and cleared the house, he was gone. To this day, I still don't know who he was or how he got in, and I don't know if they ever caught him. But I've never seen him again. And that night, that moment, was the last time I ever felt truly safe inside my own home. And I think, in all honesty, that's what hurts the most. How he stole that feeling of security from me, and I'll never be able to get it back. I've always been close with my cousin Balint. We're the same age, and ever since we were little, we've ended up in the same classes, played the same games, and got into the same kind of trouble. Not inseparable exactly, but always in step with each other, like brothers raised in different houses. This happened when we were 12, near the end of the school year in June. I was hanging out at Balint's house in a quiet suburb outside of Retsaszak. We were hyped for the weekend, eating snacks and playing FIFA in the living room when my mother called. Our grandfather had been taken to the hospital for observation. Nothing life-threatening, thankfully, but serious enough that both our parents decided to stay the night with him there. Balint's 15-year-old brother Mark was officially in charge of us while the adults were gone, which was fine by us. Mark was chill, not one of those bossy older brothers who acted like a second father. He ordered pizza for us and mostly let us do our own thing while he hung out in his room. It was already dark when someone knocked at the door. Balint got up to answer it, and I hovered behind him, curious. Standing there were two men in their mid-30s. They were dressed plainly, but something about them immediately felt off. One had on a stained windbreaker zipped up to his chin. The other wore sunglasses even though it was well past sunset. They told us they were with the city water service, and they were there to check reports of low water pressure in the neighborhood. One of them asked if our parents were home. Balint, quick to his feet, said they were unavailable, just like we were taught, and the man's eyes lingered on us for a bit too long. He then asked if he and his colleague could come inside to test the taps. Before we could say anything else, Mark appeared behind us, calm, polite but firm, and told the men the water pressure was just fine and they should check with the neighbors. The man in the windbreaker looked like he wanted to argue, but Mark had already begun to shut the door. They lingered on the doorstep for a beat before finally walking off. We locked the door and moved on. Maybe they were legit, maybe they weren't. But we were 12, and too distracted by junk food and games to really think more about that. But later that night, we all decided to sleep in Mark's room. Balint and Mark usually sleep in their own room, and since I hadn't planned to stay over, I just stripped down to my boxers. I felt a little self-conscious at first, but we were just three guys who'd known each other forever, so whatever. We stayed up late, talking about school, girls, horror movies, until we passed out. Sometime before sunrise, though, I woke up needing to pee. I padded down the hallway to the bathroom, and on my way back I heard something moving. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from the other end of the house, near the Napoli. I assumed it was Mark getting water or something, but when I stepped back into the room, both Balint and Mark were still asleep in their beds. I stood there in the doorway for a moment, heart racing. Then I leaned over and shook Mark awake. He sat up immediately when I whispered, "I think someone's inside." We crept down the hallway together, and as we turned the corner into the living room, we froze. The two men from earlier were inside the house. One of them was crouched near a cabinet with a flashlight rummaging through drawers. The other turned the moment we entered the room. Without hesitation, he pulled out a knife, which reflected a dull silver light in the moonlight. We didn't wait. Balint screamed and bolted. I was right behind him, and Mark shouted something as he flung open the door. We tore outside barefoot and half naked, and by some miracle, someone was driving by. Mark ran straight into the street, waving his arms like a madman. Turns out it was an officer, and he stopped immediately and called for backup when we told him what was happening. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived, lights flashing into the quiet night. Officers went in with weapons drawn, and they found the men still inside. One had tried to escape through the bathroom window but was caught halfway out, and the other was hiding behind the washing machine. They had broken through the laundry room window, which had a broken latch. The police later told us that the men likely knew no adults were home, and figured out that 3 boys would be easy to scare or control if things went sideways. But here's the part I still haven't lived down. While we stood outside, wrapped in borrowed blankets and giving statements, the neighbors began to emerge, curious and half asleep, and watching from their windows and porches. Among them were a few kids from school, including a girl Balint had a crush on. She saw us barefoot, wide-eyed, and in our boxers, like some humiliating teenage fever dream. When we went back to school on Monday, everyone had heard. For the next few weeks, kids whispered and laughed behind our backs. Some even called us the Boxer Boys. And while the teasing faded with time, Balint and I never forgot that night, or how close we came to some terrible fate at the hands of those robbers. Waiting on demolition permits, my dad let a few of my college friends live there rent-free. It was a dream setup, free house, no rules, as long as the neighbors didn't complain. They threw a lot of parties, and I went to a few while I was home from break. Eventually, all of them moved out, leaving my friend Kyle alone in that half-rotting tomb of a house. Kyle wasn't scared of anything. Not then. He liked his solitude. He didn't even bother locking the doors, and slept with a knife under his bed just in case, but he treated it like a joke. I was home when the phone rang. Landline days. I picked up and immediately knew something was wrong. Kyle was barely making sense, voice hoarse and panicked. He was whispering and yelling at the same time. "Don't come in, just call the police. Meet me out front. For God's sake, don't go inside." I asked him what was happening and he just kept saying the same phrase. "There's a clown in the house. A crazy clown woman, she screamed at me." He'd been sick, bedridden for 2 days with the flu. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't left his room. When he finally staggered out into the kitchen, he turned the corner, and there she was, a woman in a clown outfit, standing barefoot in the kitchen. She shrieked the moment she saw him, high and raw, like a cat screaming underwater. He ran out the back door and didn't stop running until he got to a gas station to call me. I could still hear the fear in his breath. I called the police, then I drove to the house. I found Kyle pacing outside, grey-faced and sweating. He looked worse than sick, like something had cracked behind his eyes. "She's still in there," he said. "She didn't chase me. She just screamed, but I think she's been in the house for days." That thought chilled me. Kyle had been too weak to notice, too fevered to hear her. The house was massive, with a dozen nooks and storage spaces, each bedroom practically its own apartment. She could have been there the whole time, watching him sleep. The cop pulled up about 15 minutes later. We told him everything, and he looked amused like he thought we were high, but he went in. 5 minutes passed and the door opened again, and she stepped out, and every hair on my arm stood up. She wore this shapeless white jumpsuit, filthy at the cuffs, like it had been dragged through mud. Her hair was wild, and her face, God, she'd smeared red lipstick on her lips and across her cheeks in trembling circles. Her eyes were rimmed in black, like she'd stabbed eyeliner into her sockets. She looked like a child's drawing of a crown, copied over and over until the details were corrupted. The cop had one hand lightly on her shoulder, but she didn't fight. She just stared at us expressionless, and then she saw Kyle and smiled. "You should lock your doors when you sleep," she whispered, and then giggled. The cop asked her to get into the car. That's when she started ranting. She said she owned the house and that we were the intruders. She said she had friends in Tinseltown who'd see to it that the officer was fired. She wasn't yelling, just talking fast and breathlessly, like she was afraid the words would evaporate if she paused. The officer rolled his eyes, told us he couldn't arrest her for trespassing in an abandoned property, and that's when we truly panicked. She'd just be dropped off down the road, and probably be back in an hour. Then, finally, a bit of luck. A background check revealed she had an outstanding warrant, some mental health hold from another county. The cop looked almost relieved as he cuffed her and called for a pickup. When we went back into the house, that's when the horror deepened. The kitchen cabinets had been scrawled on in red lipstick, spirals, words in backward cursive, dozens of eyes drawn with lashes that dripped like tears, and one message read, "He sleeps like a baby," covering the pantry door. On the stove was a pan with a burnt fish, 10 days old. Kyle said the leftovers he hadn't touched, and that she'd cooked and eaten it. In the hallway closet we found a pile of rags. Her nest. She'd been living there for a few days at least. Kyle's room had a connecting door to that hallway, which he had left unlocked. She'd been no more than 10 feet away from him for at least 2 nights, but maybe more. And in his fevered dreams he remembered hearing whispering, but thought it had been the radio. We'll never know what she wanted, why she didn't hurt him, what she might have done if he hadn't woken up when he did. But she had watched him. That was enough. Kyle never spent another night in that house, and my dad had it torn down months later. This happened when I was around 9 or 10. My parents almost never left me home alone. But when they did, it was always for something they didn't want to bring me to, like funerals, hospital visits, or grown-up errands they said I wouldn't understand. That night was one of those exceptions. It was a cold, grey evening in late autumn. I remember the clouds hanging low over our apartment complex. I lived with my parents on the 5th floor of an old apartment block in a quiet suburb. Concrete walls, creaky wooden floors, and buzzing lights in the hallway that flickered more than glowed. Before they left, my mum kissed me on the head and told me she'd made spaghetti for dinner, and that if they weren't back by 8:30, I should eat, brush my teeth, and go to bed. My dad reminded me not to lock the door from the inside. They had their keys and didn't want to wake me when they came back, but he said they'd call on the intercom downstairs just in case, so I'd know it was them. At the time, it felt like a small adventure, a little freedom. I remember thinking, cool, I'll do my homework quick. It must have been around 6:30 when they left. The sun had already set, and I finished my homework and lost myself in a game. The room was only lit by the flickering blue screen. The rest of the apartment was quiet and completely dark. At some point I looked up. It was 8:30 p.m. I paused my game, annoyed I hadn't eaten yet, and went to the kitchen to reheat my food in the microwave. And that's when I heard the intercom being buzzed. Now, to explain, our building had an old-school intercom system. Crackly speaker, one-button response. If someone rang the main entrance downstairs, you had to press a button inside your apartment to unlock the building door. I figured it was my parents checking in, like they said they would. So I pressed the button and answered, "Hello?" but was met with silence. I tried it again. "Okay, I'm unlocking now." I pressed the release button, but there was still no answer. "No, it's us. No, see you in a second." Nothing. It was strange. My parents always said something when they called in, even just a thanks or a laugh. But I figured maybe they were in a rush, or perhaps the intercom was acting up again. I went back to the microwave, waited, and ate a few bites of the cold spaghetti while watching the door. 5 minutes passed. 10, 15, but no one came. And that's when my stomach dropped. I lived on the 5th floor. It doesn't take 15 minutes to get an elevator. Hell, it doesn't even take that long to walk up the stairs, especially if you're eager to come home. Then it hit me like a cold splash of water. Whoever had rung the intercom weren't my parents, and I just let them into the building. I tried to shake it off, told myself there are 20 apartments in this building. No way they know which one I live in. But deep down I was already afraid. I turned off all the lights like that would somehow make me invisible, and I went back to the living room, sat in the dark holding my breath, and that's when someone rang my doorbell. Not once, not politely, but fast, frantic, and erratic, like they were slapping the button with the flat of their hand. Then came the knocking. I knew it wasn't my parents. They had the key. They would never ring like that, and they would never knock. I froze, and every instinct in my tiny body screamed for me not to move. I crawled on the floor, grabbing the biggest kitchen knife I could find, and sat there in the dark, heart hammering, breath shallow, watching the silhouette of the door. And then a calm, male voice. "I know you're in there." My blood went cold. He sounded like he was smiling. "No need to be scared. I'm the hallway cleaner. I just want a glass of water. I'm very thirsty." I didn't move. Not an inch. The wooden floor creaked if I shifted even slightly, and I knew he'd hear. "I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just very, very tired. Please let me in." I could hear him lean against the door. His breath close, I could feel it. But something was off, more than just the obvious. We didn't have a male cleaner. I'd lived there my whole life. Cleaning was done by a small team of older women. I'd seen them mopping the stairway every day before school. Never once a man. Besides, why would a cleaner be working at 8:30 at night? And why ask for water when there's a water fountain in the lobby? He kept talking and repeating himself over and over. And then he said something that made my skin crawl. "I know you're here because you let me in." He was the one on the intercom. He knew. He must have been watching and listening. Maybe he'd have seen my parents leave. Maybe he'd been watching us for days, because he knew exactly which apartment I lived in before I'd even said a word. Had he killed them, taken their key? Was he going to use them? What if he picked the lock? What if he found his way in through a balcony? My imagination spiraled in the dark, and I sat there, knees to my chest, knife clutched tight, too afraid to cry, and too terrified to even breathe. And then after what felt like hours, he stopped. No more knocking, no more talking. And then his final words, muffled but clear. "You're not a very polite little girl." And that's when I heard his footsteps echo down the hallway, fading slowly into nothing. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I sat there, tears streaming down my face, waiting for my parents. When they came home and turned on the lights, I jumped and nearly stabbed my own father out of reflex. They scolded me for still being awake. I didn't tell them what happened. I was too afraid they wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they would, and I'd never be allowed to go to a sleepover again. But for the next week, I watched every cleaner that passed through our building, every janitor, every tenant. Not once did I see a man with a cart or uniform. And to this day, I don't know who that man was, or what he really wanted. And I don't want to try and guess what that might be. I was 17 when we moved into that house, a weather-worn single story in a run-down part of town, peeling paint, broken fences, a neighborhood where streetlights flickered like dying fireflies and people would never look at each other in the eyes. The situation was complicated for me, as my parents were mid-divorce, and it was just me, my mum, and my sister May, who was 19 and trying way too hard to be the strong one for all of us. The house was cheap. That's all that mattered. The first thing that happened was the tapping. Just after sunset, always soft and measured. 3 taps on the front window. At first, we thought it was a branch or probably some kids fooling around. But whenever we'd go to check, there'd never be anyone there. You'd hear it stand up fast, open the door, and there'd be nothing. After a few times, we called the cops. They came, took our statements, and offered drive-bys. But even when they circled the block, the taps didn't stop. They just got bolder. It started happening on our bedroom windows too. Our rooms were on opposite ends of the house, but May and I both heard it, some nights more than once. We told ourselves we were imagining it, and that it was wind or stray cats. But we knew. Then, the floodlight started acting up. It was motion-activated, installed over the kitchen door that opened into the driveway. It would just click on with no one there, no footsteps, no raccoons, nothing. Just dead silence, and that bright white eye staring into the dark. It happened enough times that we knew something or someone was out there watching, maybe even testing. One night, we were all curled up on the couch, watching some dumb comedy, and May was making popcorn and Mum was half asleep. That's when we heard the doorknob twist, once and twice. It wasn't subtle. Someone was trying to open the door to the kitchen. We jumped up, ran to the window hoping to catch a glimpse, but by the time we got it, the porch was empty, and the night was still. We called the cops again. They came, took another report, and said the same thing. No print, no suspect, just 3 terrified women and a locked door that almost wasn't. Things changed after that. We didn't talk about it, but we all felt it. The slow build-up of something sinister. Paranoia clung to the walls. I started sleeping with scissors under my pillow. May kept a knife under hers. Our cousin had given it to her after the tapping started. A stupid-looking thing, pink handle and all, but at least it was sharp. It was late. I remember the clock blinking something like 2:19 a.m. when I rolled over and heard something metallic from the kitchen. The lock. Someone was picking the lock. May heard it too. Her room was right by the kitchen, and later she'd tell me the second she stood up, the motion light blazed on. Whoever it was, whoever had been stalking us for weeks, panicked and ran. We didn't see them, but we felt it. The shift in the air when a predator flees before the kill. This time the cops were furious. I'd guess they'd grown attached to us, 3 women trying to hold it together, and it wasn't just mischief anymore. They canvassed the neighborhood, and just 2 blocks over they stopped 3 teenage boys walking in the dead of night. They searched them, probable cause, and what they found chilled every last drop of warmth from my blood. Knives, duct tape, rope, a pry bar, tarps. They weren't pranksters, they were hunters. They had planned this. When questioned, one of the boys of barely 18 confessed. There were others, he said, older who were still out there, but the statement that really drove it home? We all knew those girls lived alone. They had watched us, learned our routines, and had been preparing for that night. The officers told us flat out to get a shotgun, and that if it ever happened again, just shoot through the door. We did. Later, my mum told me the boys had been stopped twice that night. The first time, just after May scared them off, the cops let them go. The second time, hours later, when they were heading back to us, that's when they were arrested and charged. One of them even did time, but I never felt safe again, because they knew we were alone, and they weren't the only ones. This happened about 2 months ago, when my parents went away for the weekend and left me in charge of the house and our pets. Normally I hate being alone overnight, especially because I'm a small, not particularly tough 18-year-old girl, and unfortunately I've made a few enemies in town. There are local guys, teenagers, who have harassed and threatened me before. So when I'm home alone, I get anxious. I double-check every lock and jump at every sound. My parents left Thursday night. That night was uneventful. So was Friday. And by Saturday night I had finally let my guard down. I was late playing games online with friends. It was around 2 a.m. and my dog was asleep behind me. The house was dark but locked up tight, and I felt okay. That's when I heard something. At first it was faint, just a sound outside, nothing unusual. People walk past my house all the time, especially drunks on the weekends. But instead of fading away, the sound grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just footsteps or laughter, it was someone yelling. After about 5 minutes of this voice staying in the same place, still yelling, I realized this wasn't just someone walking by. This person had stopped, and they were outside my house. I crept to the front window and, with shaking fingers, lifted the edge of the blind just enough to peek out. And that's when I saw him. A man, fully grown in my driveway facing my house. And I recognized him. He wasn't a stranger. He was someone my family knew. and the expression on his face was pure rage. His eyes were locked right on my window, like he knew I was behind it. He just stood there screaming, not words I could make out, but his tone was threatening, hostile and unhinged. I was frozen. He started moving closer and I kept thinking, I'm just a girl. I'm alone. And he looks furious enough to do something awful. I should have called the police, I know that, but I was panicking. So I called my sister instead. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. She stayed calm, thank God, and told me to shut the blind and just listen. See if he would go away. I sat in the dark on the floor holding my dog. He's deaf and has no idea anything was even happening. The man kept yelling for another 5 or 10 minutes, then suddenly it stopped. Silence. And then I heard something smash. My heart jumped straight into my throat and I whispered into the phone, something broke. I think it was a window. My sister told me to go downstairs and check, but I didn't want to. I was terrified I'd find him inside. But I couldn't just sit there. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and slowly crept downstairs. I checked every window, every door. Still locked. No broken glass, no sign of him through the peephole. Then my sister said she could hear yelling outside. Her house. She has 2 disabled kids, and that moment broke me. I was sure he'd gone to her place next. I was begging for her to call the cops, but just as she was about to, the yelling stopped and the man was gone. We didn't hear another sound for the rest of the night. In the morning I went outside to check. There was a smashed glass bottle on the pavement. That must have been the sound I'd heard. I never told my parents exactly who we think it was. He lives nearby, and if they know, I think they'd honestly go after him. Maybe he was just drunk. Maybe it was a harmless outburst, but he was standing in my driveway yelling into my house with hate on his face, and I was alone, frozen in fear. That's not harmless. Now whenever I hear a man's voice outside in the dark, especially if I'm home alone, I feel on edge. I always wonder though, what would have happened if I hadn't have hidden? This happened over a decade ago when I was 12 years old. I live in a small town in Oklahoma, and in my neighborhood the houses are fairly spread apart, separated by woods. It was a school day, so my grandma picked me up from school and brought me home. This was the first year that I got dropped off at my house alone. Before this, I would go to my grandma's house after school. I would get dropped off at around 3, and my parents would be home around 4:30. Not that big of a deal. Today, for some reason, my dad wasn't going to be home until around 7, and my mum, a teacher, wouldn't be home until around 8 because she had a parent-teacher conference at the school. This happened in early fall, so it wouldn't even be dark until about 8:30. I did what I usually did when I got home. I ran upstairs, got on my Xbox 360, and played Minecraft with my friends. Today it was just me and my friend Seth. It had been playing for about 2 hours when I heard a car door shut in my driveway. No one should have been here until about 7. My house is set up in a way where my upstairs has windows that look over my driveway. So, with my mic on and controller in hand, I went to the window to see who it was. Maybe my dad got home earlier than expected. I looked outside and it was a red truck. No one I know drives a red truck. The person pulled into the middle of my driveway sideways like he owned the place, and when I looked out the window I saw a man with a hat, wearing a big camo hoodie and jeans. It was September, so no one would have been wearing a big hoodie and jeans in Oklahoma. By the time I looked, he was already almost out of view, going up my walkway to my front door. I thought maybe it was one of my dad's friends, or someone my dad hired to do something, but he would usually tell me if someone was going to be coming over. Soon after I heard a knock at the door, then another. I go to the other window that has a better view of the walkway up to my front door, and I see the guy walking back down the walkway. I switch and go back to looking through the windows overlooking my driveway. I'm relaying all of this to Seth still with my mic on. I tell Seth that he's walking back to his truck now. Instead, he walks past his truck and tries to open my garage side door. At this point, my heart sinks. I tell Seth that this guy just tried to get into my house. Mind you, it was literally broad daylight at 5 p.m. Luckily, it was locked because sometimes we forget to lock it. After he tried the door, he started walking to my back patio. I drop my headset and I quietly run down the stairs to see what he's doing. I get downstairs and stand behind the wall, so I'm not visible from the back door/living room window. I just listen. I hear him try to open the door. Then I hear a thud. It sounded like he dropped a brick on the ground or something. At this point, I'm more scared than I've ever been. I wanted to call my parents or grandma, but didn't have a phone yet. The only phone in the house was in my kitchen. I would have to cross my living room to get there, and he would be able to see me if I went in there. A few seconds after the thud, I peeked around the corner and he was gone. I ran back upstairs, put my headset back on, telling Seth that he just tried to open the back door as well. As I'm telling him this, I could hear the car door shut. This time when I looked out the window, he finally got in his truck. I looked at the truck closer and noticed the only thing he had in his truck bed was a crowbar and a shovel. He sat in his truck for what felt like minutes. During this time, Seth told me to get my iPod and take a picture of his license plate. He was parked to where I couldn't see it. Then he drove backwards and out my driveway and down the road. A few minutes after he was gone, I went downstairs to see what the thud could have been. I went to the back door and see that the doormat was moved. Both big pot plants had been moved as well. He was looking for a key. We have a hidden key back there too. The key to the back door was under one of the smaller plant pots on the ledge near the door, not the bigger one he had checked under. I went to the front porch and all the pots looked like they'd been moved too. I don't know what I would have done if he'd been able to find the key or just broken in. After he left, I called my dad and told him of what happened. When my dad got home, he had a cop come over and I told him and gave him the description. But thankfully, the guy, whoever he was, never returned. About 4 years ago, during the languid stretch of summer break that followed the whirlwind of high school graduation, I found myself in an uncharacteristic state of solitude. My family had embarked on their annual pilgrimage to the beaches of North Carolina, a tradition I usually relished. However, that year held different priorities for me, as I had made the conscientious decision to remain behind, grounded by dual responsibilities of a full-time summer job and the ambitious goal of accumulating sufficient money for my impending college expenses. Adding another layer to my reasons for staying was the magnetic pull of a music festival that I was very keen to attend. In all honesty, the prospect of having the entire house to myself for a full week was an 18-year-old's dream. The quiet independence, the freedom to set my own schedule. It was like a brief taste of adulthood. Not to mention our somewhat isolated existence in the countryside offered an additional perk. The comforting assurance that there would be no disgruntled neighbors to issue noise complaints, no matter how loud my music might get or how late I chose to stay up. It seemed like the perfect recipe for a peaceful and productive interlude. Yet, as the events of one particular night would starkly reveal, my assumptions about the tranquility of my temporary bachelorhood were profoundly wrong. Typically, my route home from my friend's house involved a network of winding back roads, familiar and comforting in their quiet obscurity. However, on this specific evening, a sudden and irresistible craving for the familiar comfort food of McDonald's altered my usual course. This craving led me to take the main road, a less scenic but more direct route that happened to pass a local mechanic shop situated a short distance from the entrance of a quiet cul-de-sac. The clock had just struck midnight when I drove past the dimly lit mechanic shop. It was then I noticed an anomaly. A singular car headlight flicked on, illuminating a small patch of the otherwise dark forecourt. The vehicle itself remained stationary, but the sudden illumination of that lone headlight struck me as undeniably odd. An unsettling feeling began to prickle at the back of my neck, a feeling that intensified when, a moment later, the same car pulled out of the shop's parking lot and began to follow me. I must confess to a certain predisposition towards paranoia and a nagging tendency to overthink the intentions of those around me, especially when I'm alone at night. The thought that a car behind me might be following me with nefarious purpose was not entirely unfamiliar. Consequently, my initial reaction was to attempt to rationalize the situation, to dismiss the appearance of the one headlight car behind me as mere coincidence. I told myself it was a late hour, and perhaps this was simply someone else heading home. However, as I drew closer to my street, the unsettling reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. The same car, with its distinct uneven lighting, remained persistently in my rearview mirror, maintaining a steady distance. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in my stomach, and a sense of unease began to escalate into genuine fear. My foot pressed down slightly on the accelerator, but the single headlight behind me remained a constant, unwavering presence. Just as I was about to reach the turnoff for my street, a glance at my gas gauge sent a jolt of pure dread through me. The needle rested squarely on empty, and in that split second a critical decision had to be made. A choice fraught with potential peril. Should I turn onto the familiar safety of my own street and head for the perceived sanctuary of home, maybe luring these creepers there, and who knows what would happen then? Or should I continue driving, attempting to ascertain whether this vehicle was indeed following me, at a significant risk of running out of gas and finding myself stranded on a deserted country road in the dead of night? And worst of all, if these people had bad intentions, what would happen to me if I had no way out? Weighing the potential dangers, I made the difficult calculation that confronting whatever was happening on my own property was probably the better idea. However, unsettling. It was ultimately a less vulnerable position than being marooned and helpless on some dark, isolated stretch of asphalt. The thought of being stranded alone, without resource, far from any potential help, tipped the scales. And with a surge of nervous energy, I signaled and turned onto my street. My heart plummeted into the pit of my stomach when a moment later, the unmistakable single headlight of the car behind me also made the turn, its presence now undeniably confirmed. At that point, the last vestiges of doubt vanished. I knew with a chilling certainty that I was in trouble. Panic began to claw at the edges of my composure, but I forced myself to think, to assess my limited options. My house sat at the end of a long uphill driveway, stretching approximately 100 yards from the quiet cul-de-sac to the relative safety of my secluded property. With no other immediate escape route presenting itself, I accelerated up the incline, my tires crunching on the gravel. And to my absolute horror, the one headlight car followed, its engine a low growl in the still night air. Hindsight, as it often does, offered a glaringly obvious course of action. Looking back, I should have just called the police the moment I realized I was being followed. However, a complicated history had created a significant distrust and lack of rapport between myself and law enforcement. And in the heat of the moment, the thought simply didn't even cross my mind. The absence of my family amplified my sense of vulnerability. If they had been home, the situation would have been entirely different. I could have called my dad and he would have been there in an instant, likely armed and ready to defend our home. But they were hundreds of miles away, enjoying the carefree days at the beach. As the pursuing vehicle continued up its ascent to my driveway, mirroring my trajectory, I made a sudden impact. I slammed on my brakes and shifted the car into reverse. The other car mirrored my maneuver, but stopped short at the bottom of the driveway, effectively blocking my only direct route back to the street. Then I shifted back into drive and pulled forward, initiating a bizarre and terrifying dance. They followed. I reversed. They reversed and remained stubbornly positioned at the end of my driveway, my escape completely cut off. Realizing the futility of this back and forth, a surge of adrenaline coursed through me. I quickly drove further up the driveway, executed a sharp three-point turn, and positioned my car to face them head-on. By this time, their vehicle had advanced halfway up my driveway, the closest they had yet come. The headlights of their car now shone directly into mine, creating an unsettling standoff. Looking back on that terrifying moment, a complex mix of emotions washed over me. Raw terror, a profound sense of isolation, and a burning, incandescent fury. Who did these people think they were, invading my space and threatening my safety? With my high beams blazing directly into their windshield, momentarily blinding them, I took a deep breath and acted. I unlatched my car door and pushed it open, stepping out onto the gravel driveway. In my left hand, my fingers instinctively found and deployed the small pocket knife I habitually carried. In my right hand, I reached for the hammer I kept wedged between my seat and the door, a tool intended for minor household repairs that now took on a far more ominous potential. In a strange, desperate, and perhaps foolish moment of improvisation, I decided to hold the hammer by its heavy metal head, allowing the wooden handle to protrude outwards, hoping that in the low light and in the intensity of the situation, it could be mistaken for a handgun. Yelling at the top of my lungs, a primal scream fueled by fear and anger, I pointed my makeshift weapon directly at their car and told them to get the hell out of here. I roared, my voice cracking with adrenaline. "What do you want?" I continued to scream, brandishing the hammer like a firearm and praying with every fiber of my being that they would fall for my desperate bluff. Whether they genuinely believed the hammer was a gun, or whether they simply decided that confronting an obviously enraged and potentially dangerous individual was not worth the risk, I cannot say with any certainty. Perhaps the blinding glare of my high beams behind me cast my front in shadow, making the silhouette of the hammer more convincingly gun-like. It's also possible that they had initially perceived me as an easy target, a lone teenager, and were completely unprepared for such an aggressive and violent vocal reaction. Whatever the precise combination of factors, it worked. Slowly, hesitantly, the one-headed car began to back down my driveway. They continued to reverse cautiously, inching their way back towards the cul-de-sac. As they reached the bottom and started to move around the circular street, I, still adrenaline-fueled and wary, ran after them, keeping low and using my neighbors' parked cars as landscaping for cover. At each driveway they passed, their car would slow to a complete stop, the single working headlight panning slowly from side to side as they were meticulously casing the houses. Thankfully, despite their suspicious behavior, they didn't pull into any of the other driveways, and finally, with a surge of relief, I watched as the one headlight car turned off my street completely, disappearing into the darkness. Once I was safely back inside my house, my hands still trembling, I finally allowed myself a semblance of the McDonald's I had so desperately craved. I sat by the large front window, the curtains wide open, but all the interior lights switched off, my gaze fixed on the empty street, waiting to see if they would return. Hammer on the table, burger in hand. I'm glad to say they never did, but it really deterred me from getting the late-night munchies again in future. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed tonight's collection of Home Alone stories. If of course you did, you can let me know down below. Your comments really mean an awful lot to me, so thank you. I really appreciate everyone tuning in this month. It's a lot of work, but I think you guys are enjoying it, so it makes it all worthwhile. I will be hitting you up tomorrow with some haunted house stories, so be sure to come back tomorrow to listen to those. And finally, a huge thank you as always to my members and patrons. They get some exclusive perks, including but not limited to exclusive stories before everyone else, being able to vote on upcoming videos, and a whole bunch of other cool random perks. So if you're interested in perhaps getting some of those or just supporting me, you can follow the link to Patreon to find out more. But that's it from me, guys. Stay awesome and hopefully see you tomorrow. Good night.